So I want to talk about Peter Turchin's Ages of Discord, and this is, I'm going to do a series of videos about the book. You're going to sort of follow along with me as I read the text, and sort of chew through the ideas and think around it. And I've just begun the text, and what's so striking to me is that Turchin asserts that he has discovered a science of history that, now obviously this is not at all a new claim. If you're a reader or a philosophy of history nerd, you know that this claim has been made since Hegel and maybe before. I know that at least Hegel claimed this and thought that everything was moving toward this sort of perfection in the mind of God. His phenomenology of spirit is a pretty clear articulation, and by clear I mean unclear. I don't know why I said clear. It's not clear. A very unclear, a very murky articulation of a worldview that basically says we're moving toward a kind of teleological perfection. And what do I mean by teleology, right? There's this term telos, which means end or purpose, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a Greek term. And so, for example, you have an acorn, right? An acorn has its telos in becoming a tree. It's not just what it is, it's what it's meant to become. And history itself has a telos. We get this worldview really from the Judeo-Christian look at history. It could also be argued that the Zoroastrian influence contributes to this, but our culture is not Zoroastrian, right? Our culture, Western culture, is Judeo-Christian. And Judeo-Christianity has a linear, teleological philosophy of history behind it. It has a vision of history from the fall with Adam and Eve to this point called the resurrection of the dead, right? Judgment Day, and you certainly find it. It's a really central core element of Islam as well. But Islam is an Abrahamic religion, so we again see there's this sort of Judeo-Christian influence. But again, in the West, it's mostly Judaism and Christianity especially. If you really study the book of Revelation, traditionally, the way this book has been looked at, in addition to being, a document about some events occurring during the reign of Nero, etc., it's also seen as a template for history as a whole. That this is the course that world events will take, culminating, ultimately, in the resurrection of the dead and the descent of a new heaven and a new earth. Our politics will never work out. That's one of the central themes of Revelation. And I want to do a series on Revelation at some point. But the idea in Revelation is that earthly politics are always prone to be screwed up. It's not going to work out on earth until God himself becomes our ruler. We're not going to need light anymore. There's not going to be day or night because God himself is going to be our illumination. During this time when a new Jerusalem is going to come down because the temple is destroyed, remember, in the first century. So there's no temple anymore. That what we see as what was established as this city of God of the Jewish people is gone. And in Christianity, it's thought that Christ himself and the church, etc., like that this replaces the temple, that it replaces Israel. This is the Christian worldview, obviously. But then it's still not going to be perfect. Life is still going to be a mess because we're a fallen species. But in the end, sorry, there was a car buzzing outside. But we're a fallen species, ultimately. But in the end, that Christ himself, God himself, will, after a series of catastrophic occurrences, the nightmare of history, when it finally ends, God himself will come to rule, and his rule will be a perfect and perfectly just one, to which only the righteous, are only the righteous are invited to live in this final perfect city. But so that's the vision that upon which Western culture, at least as we conceive of it now, is founded. And so everything is, at least in Western philosophy, whether you think of progressive politics or right-wing politics in America, both of them are deeply influenced by this vision. Marxism is deeply influenced by this vision. Marx doesn't believe in God, actually. Marx feels that everything spiritual, he says base precedes superstructure. So what that means is that, say you have a beautiful, say you have a society that has a river god, right? And, we use a lot of water metaphors, etc. Well, that's because we live by the river. And the way that we earn our means of material existence, the way that we survive, etc., that's where our culture derives. So economic and material conditions actually determine how a culture develops. But a spiritual worldview would say that it's the other way around, that there are spiritual conditions that determine the physical attributes of life. So is the physical subservient to the spiritual? Or, according to Marx or someone like Freud, are the material conditions actually what cause us to create things like culture, etc.? So, but Marx, again, even there, you can see that he's working in the template. He's working in the worldview of Christianity. He's just reversing it and changing it. But even in the end, in Marx, right, he says that the history, in the Communist Manifesto, the very beginning, it says the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. So once again, we find that there's this sense of this is how the motor of history moves. History itself is a kind of nightmare. It's not a good thing. But finally, Marx thinks everything is about to culminate in a moment where that class-based society is no longer going to exist. We're going to end up in a classless society where everyone, where goods are distributed from each according to his ability to each according to his need. That there's going to be this perfect society when finally human beings become united with their essence, from which they've been alienated for so long. It's a long story. I'll do another video about Marx. But anyhow, Marx himself as well has this sense of there's going to be an end of history as we know it coming. And he's a really good example of this, what you would call almost like a messianic vision. Derrida calls Marxism a messianism without a messiah, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that's a good way to look at it. But there's this sort of template of a way of looking at or understanding history. Even the idea of history itself is sort of pregnant with those implications in the West. And so this idea of a scientific or a strict, principled, rule-based, at least, outlook toward what history is, that's not at all new. But Peter Turchin seems to have an interesting perspective on it. And not only that, he is claiming that we may well be on the verge of another civil war. And that's what I want to talk about because, in 2010 he was making these predictions and it seemed that, he wasn't taken terribly seriously because circumstances weren't nearly as dire in 2010 as they are right now. But if I'm not mistaken, he actually predicted an epidemic as well, or a pandemic. But I want to read one of the opening passages of his book where he is comparing the American Civil War to our current situation. I'm sorry about the police siren. Stand-up comedians, apparently it's like a really hacky joke among stand-up comedians, like when you're doing stand-up and the cop siren comes, you say, oh, my ride is here. It's not a very funny joke, though. Okay. So, At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter, located on an island in the middle of Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. After 34 hours of bombardment, the commander of the U.S. troops defending the fort, Major Robert Anderson, gave the order to strike the flag. The first battle of the American Civil War was over. Curiously, there were no casualties, a strange beginning for the bloodiest war in American history. That this war happened at all is itself strange. Both sides spoke the same language and professed the same religion. There is no shortage of food or land, with a huge and lightly populated western frontier ready to absorb millions of settlers. Even stranger, it happened in a democracy. For the first 80 years of the American polity, its democratic institutions had sufficed to resolve the inevitable clashes of interests found in any large society. Political crises were diffused within the constitutional framework. In other words, without violence. In 1861, however, these institutions failed catastrophically. By this point, the American political elites had lost their ability to cooperate in finding a compromise that would preserve the Commonwealth. And instead of diffusing the crisis, popular elections in which Abraham Lincoln won the presidency triggered the conflagration. What is particularly astounding is how myopic the American political leaders and their supporters were on the eve of the Civil War, especially those from the southern states. They gleefully wrecked the Union without realizing what a heavy personal cost that would mean for most of them. So he draws some parallels to the modern day, and this is what I really want to talk about, and this is why I want to make a series about this book and about the possibility of a coming civil war. Hopefully as a warning, and hopefully it'll get people talking and thinking. So he writes, in the 1860s, Americans learned that large-scale, complex societies are actually fragile, and that a descent into civil war can be rapid. Today, 150 years later, this lesson has been thoroughly forgotten. The degree to which cooperation among the American political elites has unraveled during the past decade, and it's eerily similar to what happened in the 1850s, the decade preceding the Civil War. The divisive issues are different, although the fault line between the North and the South endures. But the vehemence and the disregard for the consequences of failing to compromise are the same. Of course, nobody expects another civil war, but the political leaders of antebellum America also could not have imagined in their wildest dreams the eventual consequences of the choices they made during the 1850s. As another historical example, it is doubtful that when the Assembly of French Notables rejected royal proposals for the state budget in 1788, they intended to start the French Revolution, in which many of them would lose their heads to the guillotine. Just because we cannot imagine our actions leading to disaster, it doesn't mean that such a disaster cannot happen. And that's the point. A year ago, we never would have predicted the absolute apocalyptic misery of 2020. And things can most certainly get worse. So that's what I want to talk about. And I want to talk about Turchin's methodology a little later, about the sort of scientific elements of his theory and how he arrives at the conclusions that he has. And yeah, I would love to hear what you think. Please like and subscribe, share this video. I'll be posting a lot more. I'm going to try and post as regularly as possible. And I'm going to be talking about all sorts of philosophy of history stuff and big books and big ideas. So yeah, this is just my first video, but I'll be talking to you very soon. Thanks for watching.